While it sounds crazy in terms of learning how to play a game better, there is a huge difference between playing to win and not playing to win. And no, that second option isn't just AFKing it out and letting yourself lose. In fact, not playing to win tends to revolve around exploring new paths, trying things you haven't tried before at the risk of them not working. But due to the sheer focus Final Fantasy XIV players, or in fact players in general at times, can have on never risking failure, this can often drive us into always picking the easiest option. And if that happens to mean that we land in a dead end with no more space for direct improvement, we might just get stuck. Let's talk about that. So, when I say playing to win, I am referring to playing in a way you are well acquainted with. You play the job you know best, and you play it the way you always do. You try your best to do the fight the exact way you always do. For example, in a Souls-like adjacent game, if you're not used to using, say, your special moves and typically rely on just swinging and dodging, while playing to win, you are certainly not going to start parrying, blocking, and introducing special moves, because doing so introduces a risk that you are not familiar with. In a fighting game, when playing to win, you will probably rely solely on combos and tricks you have practiced, if any, and almost certainly only the ones that you are confident you can reliably do. In a MOBA, think League of Legends, you may just end up picking only that one character you have practiced a ton and use the exact same build every single time, even when the opponents counterpick you or even buy items to counter your build. Naturally, in many of these cases, you possibly arrived at this specific strategy when, for instance, you initially picked up the game. And since it worked this long, and now you've put in 10, maybe 20 hours, who knows, trying something else feels like an insurmountable task. 10 new hours of learning or what? Probably not, but that can be how it feels. And, more importantly, doing so also comes with the risk that you might perform worse than you normally do, and then you just might fail. In essence, playing to win is locking in and relying on precisely the strategy or strategies that you already know or think you can rely on. On the other hand, when I say not playing to win, another way to phrase it is playing to learn. But focusing on the winning part tends to get the point across more. To truly be able to let go and allow yourself to focus on learning and improving, you kind of also have to accept the fact that you might just lose as a result. In the Souls-like, you allow yourself to get smacked in your pursuit to see if you can figure out how parrying works. In the fighting game, while you may have labbed some combos in training, you kinda need to see how it goes in a real fight and practice it regularly to actually be able to get the proper muscle memory to call upon it when the opportunity arises. And for a MOBA match, while you might be able to theory craft a specific answer to when your opponent counters your plan, to truly know what works, you may actually have to try some stuff, or some other characters, in an actual match. Now, interestingly, between these three genres, the MOBA perspective is probably the one that somehow relates the most to Final Fantasy XIV. How? Well, when you choose to not play to win in a Souls-like, or adjacent, it means you are more likely to lose, and if you do, you get sent back to the checkpoint. In a fighting game, most of the time, choosing not to play to win means that you are more likely to lose, which loses you ranking, assuming it is a ranked game. But it only really impacts you. In a MOBA, you choosing to not play to win means that your team is more likely to lose, and unless you convince them all to also play a learner's game, it kinda means that your practice match, which you have already written off as a loss in the first place, is only everyone else in your team's match to lose. And unless it is a pre-made, they won't really stand to benefit from your newly acquired skills as a result. In fact, you might never play those players ever again, or you might face them as their opponent next time. So they lose a match and you're better off for it. Naturally, this is a bit of an exaggeration, as obviously when you don't play to win, as was stated before, it doesn't mean that you are playing to lose. Presumably, you're trying something that you believe might work, or at the very least, you know what you normally do in that situation doesn't work very consistently, or not as well as it could. So whether it is your practice at the cost of your team kinda boils down to whether whatever you were cooking actually worked. And that is where Final Fantasy XIV probably enters the picture. Exactly what playing to win looks like and what not playing to win looks like can vary heavily depending on what level of content you're doing. For instance, in the context of a Savage Raid encounter, not playing to win could mean exploring an alternative way to handle a mechanic, perhaps a greedier way to handle a mechanic. Maybe trying if you can sneak in one more GZD before you have to jump away, staying a little longer on those ley lines, that kind of stuff. It could also be a pull where you don't attack at all just to practice the mechanics themselves. However, I believe this strategy is a lot more common in statics specifically. On the other hand, playing to win in this context is when you play the rotation that you have already practiced or just know of muscle memory, with no funny business. The clearing pull. In a rather extreme case, one could probably easily picture the not playing to win approach to be that guy who dies to that stupid mechanic for the 5th time because they are that close to making that GZD fit, especially when that small damage gain didn't really matter in the grand scheme of things anyway. At the same time, there is that saying that it is only greed if it doesn't work out. And, at least in the past, if it isn't the case anymore, some high-level players believed that the sign of a good DPS player was one willing to take these risks, willing to not play to win, every time. In a similar fashion to the MOBA example, if Greedy Samurai Steve is in your static raid team, then you can all as a team choose to do pulls with the express focus on learning, or at the very least, more easily confront Steve when you feel like he has tried that one trick enough. Whatever he does figure out, your team will be the one mainly benefiting from it, making it possibly a worthwhile investment. On the other hand, if Greedy Samurai Steve is just some rando in Party Finder, you will probably not put up with him failing that same mechanic over and over for his learning opportunity for very long. Of course, that depends on your patience. While it may be a bit of a leap in logic, it could be said that not playing to win is a playstyle that finds its home in pre-made statics, as when you play with strangers, doing anything but playing to win could be considered rude and a waste of other people's time in some weird way. This itself can then motivate players to lean a lot heavier on jobs in their preferred role that are considered easier to play, as it reduces the chance for someone to accidentally quote-unquote not play to win. Similarly, this can also be the reason why once a player has learned a specific way to clear a fight, they refuse to learn another strategy, which itself sometimes motivates players in Party Finder to learn one specific strategy, same for everyone, to avoid this issue in the first place, even if it isn't always the best strategy. Now, this perspective of playing to win against not playing to win in Savage Raiding can be translated to most harder content. You will probably feel less inclined to mess around in a ranked Crystalline Conflict match, or a high floor in a deep dungeon, or whatever else you can come up with, where not only is there a lot more on the line, but potentially also other people involved. Broadly speaking, many players simply will not feel comfortable with taking a risk, which can then lead their improvements to stagnate extremely hard when whatever they are doing stops working, as now they only see improvements when they accidentally discover some new tech while doing what they normally do. Where this gets even more interesting, at least to me, is when we take a look at more casual content like dungeons, normal trials, normal raids. Now, of course, in casual content, it is a lot more likely that some players are simply autopiloting, quote-unquote, which tends to land closer to playing to win than not to win, since the only thing that really matters in the situation where someone is autopiloting through a duty is that it eventually clears, meaning anything before the clear becomes irrelevant, and not playing to win essentially inverses this view and focuses on anything but the victory itself. However, what makes casual content particularly interesting in the context of playing to win, or not, is that players, not everyone of course, but many, have gotten more and more obsessed with never failing. To be more specific, it isn't entirely uncommon to hear the suggestion that a casual duty is tuned too hard, according to some, if they feel like wipes are a somewhat regular occurrence in the duty. Now, on the one hand, for a significant number of players, casual duties are generally just not tuned hard enough that there should be any reason to be concerned about vibing in the first place. On the other hand, it's not like that applies to everyone. This can lead to a situation where even the casual content, which you'd think is where you're safe to not play to win, becomes a place where you have to bring it, quote-unquote. Not as much as in a hard duty, but still quite a bit. And while yes, there are definitely players that are not improving much simply because they don't care, this might be able to explain a bit more about three somewhat different concepts. 1. How there are players at relatively high level that might push back hard on suggestions for improvement. 2. Why particularly easy to pick up jobs tend to have more popularity than harder ones. And 3. Some duty design decisions, perhaps. For the first one, I have definitely met, and I'm sure you have too, players that are clearly actively thinking about how they fight in Final Fantasy XIV, and they might care directly about their performance too, but will push back if you suggest something that can significantly impact how they are currently playing. Sometimes it can be something minor, like some rotational detail they aren't considering. But other times it can be a healer that barely ever attacks, because they got by quite aggressively spamming heals in low level, and at some point in their journey they had established that as their default strategy. And changing things up introduces the risk of failure, which they might have been okay with in the ARR leveling experience, but now that they invested tens of hours in, they would rather not risk it, especially not with strangers. It could be a tank that got away with single pulling every single duty on their way, and yeah, at some point, the average player starts to expect a bit more. But at that time, this tank had already solidified one pack at a time as their default, and don't want to introduce change and risk failure with strangers. One of the funniest ones to me is sometimes running into DPS that refuse to use their big cooldowns on the AoE pulls because they need to save it all for the bosses. This example might also most effectively highlight how this pushback to changing the plan can occur in the first place. The player is used to opening a boss fight with all of their buttons available, and they might be worried that changing that will lead to them failing on the boss in some way. And to introduce using cooldowns outside of the boss fights, you have to introduce the risk of not having them for the boss fight, even if it doesn't matter that much most of the time. But if you're going into a duty assuming that you must play to win, then it makes perfect sense that this player will not budge on the topic. And I just want to add that I am perfectly aware that 99% of players queuing casual content won't really mind or care, but some players will be this scared of taking a risk, either because they did run into that 1% that made a big deal of it, or simply because they fear the possibility of running into such an individual. Or maybe they just don't want to, cause problems for anyone, ever. This is the kind of stuff that makes not playing to win, or playing to learn, remember, a bit difficult with strangers in a team game. For the second concept, Jobs like Viper, for instance, with not that many moving parts and a reasonably simple rotation, seems to be a lot more attractive to a more casual player. In fact, the whole holding cooldowns for the boss thing is a lot less clear on a Viper, since you have like one especially impactful cooldown anyway. Similarly, in the supporter aisle, Warrior and Paladin being considered the quote-unquote simpler tanks to pick up helps a lot, both because they both have less intense rotations than the other two tanks, but they also have a much stronger suite of self-healing options to be more reactive rather than proactive. A proactive style may require more testing than just going with what you know, which makes these tanks feel safer. This same logic may also be why pure healers might seem more attractive to a more casual player, as the barrier healers seem to require a bit more planning, and strategies like cure botting tends to work better, quote-unquote, on Astrologian and White Mage. While I don't have any more than personal observations, I am not claiming to have straight data on this, it does appear to be the case that more and more players might prefer these kinds of, quote, safer to wing it, unquote, jobs. Which might also explain why some jobs in recent memory have been reworked in the way that they have. I'd argue that both Black Mage, Summoner, and to some degree Monk used to require a lot more thinking ahead before their respective reworks or major overhauls. Now, whether these changes actually made them more popular is a whole separate conversation, but if development are noticing such a trend, it makes sense to try and make more jobs more palatable by fitting them into that kind of style, I suppose. For the third concept, most definitely, relative to previous expansions, Dawntrail dungeons, especially the leveling ones, are considered harder overall by many. However, based on the fact that typically a Realm Reborn or even Heavensward dungeons can sometimes actually be considered more challenging, I am willing to suggest that part of the reason why we, the players, don't always agree on these difficulties is because for someone who is using their entire toolkit, Dawntrail might feel easier than Endwalker, which might feel easier than Shadowbringers, and so on, because when using your entire toolkit, the relative player power has increased faster than the dungeon difficulties. However, if a player settles on their default strategy to play to win at like, say, Stormblood levels, they might be less inclined to actually make proper use of whatever they get after that. They are already fully acquainted with what they have and what they can do and what works. It might feel a bit like unlocking a new super move in an RPG like 40 hours into the game. Unless you force yourself to, you are much less likely to use the darn thing. So, to wrap up a bit on this discussion, if you want to improve at Final Fantasy XIV, or any game really, or actually almost anything really, one of the most effective ways to really start to see improvements is to allow yourself to try something you aren't sure will work. Test your limits, take risks, especially in the content meant for that stuff. There's nothing wrong with wiping in a dungeon, you can just go again, and when things go sideways, you know that you might need more practice with that one, or that trick just won't work. Additionally, finding places to practice more efficiently is also an excellent idea. It does feel like a lot of players just don't want to take the time to practice their rotation on a striking dummy, but speaking from experience, it is one of the best ways to work that muscle memory, regardless of the fear of involving other players in a dungeon context. How do you go about improving your play? Whether it is in 14 or any other game, or actually honestly, any skill in life, I would say. I would love to hear about it in the comments. Do you recognize this sort of tendency to default to what you normally do? Maybe not, out of fear of failing with other players involved? I would also love to know about this. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, while you can often get by with knowing an opener, a general rotation in a 2-minute burst for a job, some jobs with these things somewhat set in stone might randomly see major oddities several minutes into a fight that you might only truly get acquainted with if you actually practice that. For example, Pictomancers have an oddity with Mark of the Ages about 6 minutes into a fight, and since Viper generates more than 3 reawakens per 2 minutes, there will be 2-minute cycles with 4 reawakens that you may need to take into account.